The night of May 28th, 1453, smelled like the end of the world. Not metaphorically, not in the poetic sense that historians reach for when they want to dress up a military disaster in borrowed grandeur. Literally. The air above Constantinople that Tuesday evening carried the layered stench of 53 days of siege. Burnt stone and scorched timber, the sulphurous bite of gunpowder that had settled into the soil and the clothing and the lungs of every living person inside the walls. The iron-copper smell of blood that never quite washed away from the sections of the Theodosian wall where the fighting had been heaviest. And underneath all of it, the older, stranger smell of a city that had been burning in slow motion for nearly 2 months and had not yet decided whether it was going to survive. The fires from the Ottoman bombardment had not stopped. They had simply become normal. The constant low percussion of the bombards, that world-shaking thud that defenders had learned over 7 weeks to register as background noise, the way a man who lives near a river learns to sleep through the sound of water, had stilled for the night. But only because the crews were resting their guns and because Mehmed II had other plans for the hours before dawn. It was the city's last night, though almost no one inside the walls knew that yet with certainty. They suspected it. The scouts who had slipped out through the blockade weeks earlier to look for the Venetian relief fleet had returned with nothing. No sails on the Marmara, no signal fires, no Allied warships cutting through the Ottoman naval cordon. The whole of Western Christendom, which had been promising rescue for months with the particular sincerity of powers that are watching someone else's catastrophe from a safe distance, had not come. The Pope had sent letters. The Doge of Venice had convened committees. The King of Hungary had expressed concern. None of them had sent enough. Inside Constantinople, 7,000 people were defending 4 miles of the most sophisticated land fortification the ancient world had ever produced. On the other side of those walls, between 60 and 80,000 Ottoman soldiers waited in the darkness, their torches forming a line of fire that encircled the city like a tightening iron ring, close enough to be heard, close enough for the smell of their cook fires to drift across the moat on the night wind, close enough that the defenders on the walls could hear, faintly, the sound of drums beginning. 7,000 against 80,000. One city against an empire. One era against another. This is not simply the story of how Constantinople fell. Cities fall. Empires collapse. That is the nature of human constructions. They rise, they persist longer than seems reasonable, and then something comes along that they were not built to withstand. What makes the 29th of May, 1453, different from every other date on the long calendar of urban catastrophe is what that something was. It was not a larger army, though the army was larger. It was not a braver general, though the general was remarkable. It was a weapon, a technology, a shift in the fundamental relationship between offense and defense that had governed warfare for 1,000 years, rendered obsolete in the space of 7 weeks by a Hungarian cannon maker who had first offered his services to the city he would help destroy. This day did not simply end the Byzantine Empire. It ended medieval warfare. And in ending medieval warfare, it ended the medieval world, cracking it open the way the bombards cracked the Theodosian wall, letting in something new and dangerous and impossible to put back. To understand what was lost on May 29th, you have to understand what Constantinople was. Not what it had been at its height, which was magnificent beyond easy description, but what it had become by the time Mehmed II set his siege guns in their platforms on the Western Plain and lit the first fuse. By 1453, the Byzantine Empire was not an empire in any territorial sense. It was a city. One city, surrounded on every side by Ottoman land, its population reduced from the 400,000 of the 12th century to perhaps 40 or 50,000 souls, barely enough to staff the walls, let alone supply the armies that a serious defense required. The city had been looted by its own supposed allies in 1204, when the armies of the Fourth Crusade had sacked Constantinople with a thoroughness that stunned even the medieval world, which had high standards for military brutality. The Byzantines had reconquered it in 1261, but they had never recovered from it. By the 15th century, the city was, in the words of a contemporary observer, a series of walled villages separated by vast fields enclosed within the 5th century ramparts, a patchwork of inhabited pockets and weedy open ground, where imperial grandeur persisted mostly in architecture and ceremony rather than in any functional sense of power. And yet those walls stood. The Theodosian Wall, completed in 413 AD and reinforced and repaired across the centuries, was not simply a fortification. It was an argument, a physical statement about the relationship between human engineering and military force that had been tested 20 times and never definitively answered. The system ran for roughly 4 miles across the landward approach to the city, which was the only direction from which a land attack was possible, since the other 3 sides of Constantinople's triangular peninsula were bounded by water. The wall itself was a layered structure, a 20-metre-wide moat in front, then a low outer wall with battlements, then a gap of open ground where attackers caught between the 2 walls became targets from above, and then the main inner wall, 12 metres high, studded with towers every 45 to 55 metres, that rose to 18 metres and gave defenders overlapping fields of fire in every direction. 900 years, 20 sieges, 0 successful frontal assaults. The only time Constantinople had fallen to an enemy attack was in 1204, and that had involved a carelessly unlatched door rather than any failure of the wall itself. This was the reality that every commander who had ever looked at those ramparts had eventually accepted. You could not break through them. You had to find another way in, or you had to wait. But waiting was what Mehmed II had come here specifically not to do. He was 21 years old when he arrived before Constantinople in April 1453, and this fact is worth sitting with for a moment before proceeding, because it shapes everything that follows. 21, the same age at which most men are still working out what they believe about the world and what they want from it. Mehmed had already committed his empire's entire military capacity to the capture of a city that had resisted every previous attempt at reduction, including an effort by his own father less than 30 years earlier. He had been thinking about Constantinople since he was a child, literally since childhood, since the accounts of his early education describe him poring over maps of the city and studying the campaigns of every commander who had tried and failed to take it. He spoke 6 languages. He had read Homer and drew comparisons between himself and Alexander the Great with the particular confidence of a young man who sees no reason why the comparison should be considered immodest. He had studied Islamic theology with the same intensity he brought to military strategy, and to him the conquest of Constantinople was inseparable from prophecy. The Prophet Muhammad had said, 14 centuries before this night, that Constantinople would one day fall to a great Muslim leader, and Mehmed had decided, with the clarity of the genuinely certain, that he was that leader. But Mehmed was not simply a young man burning with prophetic ambition. He was something more dangerous, a young man with prophetic ambition and a talent for applied engineering. When he came to the throne for the second time in 1451, the first major construction project he ordered was not a palace or a mosque, but a fortress, Rumeli Hisari, built on the European bank of the Bosphorus at its narrowest point, directly across from an existing Ottoman fortress on the Asian side. Together, the two forts gave Mehmed control of the strait. Constantinople could no longer receive resupply from the Black Sea. The city was not yet besieged, but it had been quietly strangled. The move was strategic, patient, and invisible until it was done. The act of a man who understood that the preparation for victory begins long before the first shot is fired. The first shot, when it came, was fired by a cannon built by a man named Orban. Orban was Hungarian. He was a cannon founder, a craftsman who worked in the early and experimental technology of large bronze guns, which in the mid-15th century was simultaneously one of the most valued and most dangerous specializations available to a military contractor. He had arrived in Constantinople in 1452, seeking employment at the imperial court, offering Emperor Constantine XI the thing that Constantine most needed: the ability to cast bronze artillery large enough to matter in a siege. Constantine had listened to his pitch, understood what he was being offered, and then, in one of the most consequential decisions in the history of military technology, had told Orban that the imperial treasury could not meet his price. The empire was too poor. The cannon maker was thanked and turned away. Orban went to Edirne, the Ottoman capital, and made the same offer to Mehmed II. Mehmed did not ask whether the treasury could afford it. He asked whether the cannon could breach the walls of Constantinople. Orban said yes. Said, reportedly, that he could cast a gun powerful enough to breach the walls of Babylon itself. Mehmed told him to build it. He was given every resource he asked for: metal, manpower, space, time, money. The result was the basilica, a bronze bombard 8.2 meters long, with walls 20 centimeters thick, capable of hurling a stone ball weighing 500 kilograms a distance of 1.5 kilometers. It took 42 days to transport from Edirne to Constantinople. It required 60 oxen and 1,000 men. When it was finally positioned before the Theodosian wall and test-fired, the sound was heard 16 kilometers away, and the ground trembled within a radius that defenders described as feeling like an earthquake. Constantine XI Palaiologos had 49 years of life behind him when the first Ottoman bombard round struck the walls of his city on April 6, 1453. He was the 11th Byzantine emperor to bear the name Constantine, which gave his situation a weight of numerological portent that he was sophisticated enough to recognize and pragmatic enough to set aside. He was not a theorist or a philosopher emperor in the tradition some of his predecessors had cultivated. He was a soldier. He had spent his career fighting, in the Peloponnese, against the Latins, in the complicated border skirmishes of a shrinking empire. And when he became emperor in 1449, his instinct had been the same instinct that had served him in the field: assess the ground, reinforce the weak points, and hold. He had ordered the Theodosian wall inspected section by section. He had brought in engineers to patch the places where 9 centuries of weather and minor damage had left vulnerabilities. He had written to every Christian monarch in Europe, laying out the situation with a directness that bordered on desperation. We are surrounded. We are outnumbered. We need soldiers and ships. And if you do not come, we will fall, and the consequences will be yours to live with. He had sent those letters and received promises in return. Promises, and then silence. The one man who came, the one concrete professional military assistance that arrived in Constantinople before the Ottoman noose closed, was a Genoese soldier named Giovanni Giustiniani Longo. He arrived in January 1453 with 700 men, all veterans, equipped at his own expense, responding to a personal sense of obligation to the defence of Christian civilization that had apparently survived the institutional failure of every official Christian authority in Europe to do the same. Constantine appointed him commander of the land defences immediately. Justiniani was, by every account that survived the siege, exactly what the situation required. Technically expert, calm under pressure, able to manage the complex multi-ethnic force that the defence had assembled from Genoese, Venetian, Greek and miscellaneous Italian volunteers who were defending the same walls but did not always agree on much else. He was also, as it would turn out, mortal, and his mortality would matter more than almost anything else on the morning of the 29th. What was at stake here is difficult to convey without resorting to the kind of abstraction that drains events of their human weight. So, what was at stake, specifically, was this. For a man standing on the Theodosian wall in the spring of 1453, looking out at the Ottoman siege lines and the forest of tents and the line of artillery that had been grinding away at the stonework since April, what was at stake was his life and the lives of his family. Because when a medieval city fell to assault, the 3 days of looting that followed by custom and practice were 3 days in which the distinction between combatant and civilian became largely theoretical. Beyond that, for the city's population, what was at stake was everything they had built, in a place their ancestors had built for 1,200 years. Churches, workshops, libraries, the particular texture of a life lived within a specific community that had survived plague and crusade and fire and siege and maintained its character through all of it. Beyond that, for the Christian world watching from a distance, what was at stake was the eastern anchor of European civilization. The city that had preserved the learning of antiquity through the centuries when Western Europe had lost access to much of it. The city that contained in its libraries manuscripts of Aristotle and Plato and Archimedes that existed nowhere else on Earth. And beyond all of that, at the level where history operates on its largest scales, what was at stake was something even the participants could not have fully articulated. The age, the era, the world organized around the assumption that stone walls made power, that cavalry and infantry and Greek fire determined outcomes, that the siege was a contest of patience and supply rather than a problem to be solved by applied physics. That world was about to end. But the people living in it did not know that yet. The geography of Constantinople had been its greatest military asset for 12 centuries, and it remained so in 1453, which is why Mehmed's problem was not simply how to break the walls, but how to neutralize the advantages that the city's position conferred on its defenders. Constantinople occupied the tip of a triangular peninsula, with the Sea of Marmara on its southern coast, the Bosphorus Strait on its eastern edge, and the Golden Horn, a natural harbour inlet curving around the city's northern face, protecting the sea walls on that side. The only land approach to the city was from the west, which was exactly where the Theodosian wall stood. The sea walls on the Marmara side were lower and less elaborate than the land walls, but the currents and rocks of the Marmara made a naval assault from that direction difficult enough that no attacker had successfully managed it. The Golden Horn was protected by a chain, a massive iron barrier stretched from the Tower of Galata, held by the Genoese colony of Pera, across the mouth of the inlet to the Byzantine shore, which physically prevented Ottoman ships from entering the harbour and attacking the less defended northern sea walls. Mehmed's initial disposition was therefore straightforward in theory and brutally difficult in practice. Encircle the city, block the sea approaches, and batter the Theodosian wall into submission with his artillery. The land army encamped along the western face of the city, with the artillery positioned in platforms before the main wall sections. His fleet of roughly 130 vessels, 31 large warships, and a supporting cast of transports and smaller craft occupied the Bosphorus and the Sea of Marmara, maintaining the naval blockade. The chain across the Golden Horn kept his ships out of the harbour, but it also meant that the northern sea walls were defended only lightly, because Constantine had no ships to spare for that front, and assumed, reasonably, that the chain made a serious naval attack from the Golden Horn impossible. Mehmed also assumed this, initially, and then he decided to make it no longer true. The artillery train that Mehmed had assembled was unprecedented in the history of siege warfare, not simply because of the basilica, but because of the systematic thought that had gone into deploying multiple batteries across the full width of the attack frontage. 14 artillery positions had been established along the 4-mile stretch of the Theodosian Wall, ranging from the Blachernae district in the north, where the wall was older and structurally weaker, having been built at a different time and integrated imperfectly with the main Theodosian system, to the Gate of St. Romanus in the centre, which Mehmed had identified as the primary target. The basilica and the largest bombards were positioned before the St. Romanus Gate. They fired, on average, 7 rounds a day, each round requiring roughly 2 hours to cool, reload and re-aim. The smaller cannon, of which there were dozens, could fire over 100 times per day and served a different function: suppression, harassment, the grinding psychological pressure of continuous noise and concussive impact that prevented defenders from sleeping and kept repair crews working under fire. The wall, it turned out, could be damaged. What the Ottomans had not anticipated was how quickly it could be repaired. Each evening, when the bombardment paused, Constantine organized teams of civilians, women, monks, elderly men, anyone capable of carrying stone and pouring mortar, to fill the gaps that the cannon had opened during the day. The repairs were imperfect, crude earthwork and rubble fill rather than proper masonry, but they restored the profile of the wall well enough to force the bombards to spend the next day breaking the same ground again. This was the fundamental dynamic of the first 6 weeks of the siege. Mehmed's guns broke the wall by day. Constantine's civilians rebuilt it by night. The wall degraded slowly, but did not collapse. The defenders held on, but grew more exhausted with every passing week. The arithmetic was merciless. The Ottomans could rotate fresh units into the firing positions and the repair crews. The defenders could not. The force that Giustiniani commanded was a coalition of competence rather than a unified military. The 700 Genoese professionals he had brought formed the core, but alongside them were Venetian sailors who had been in the city when the siege began and had offered their service, Greek militiamen of varying quality, a contingent of Catalans, a company of Neapolitan archers who had been sent by the King of Naples, and who died defending a city that their king would never bother to rescue. And Orhan Çelebi, an Ottoman pretender, a cousin of Mehmed's, who had been held in Constantinople as a diplomatic card for years, and who, in the final accounting, chose to fight and die for the empire that had kept him, rather than defect to the one that would certainly have executed him anyway. These men were deployed in sections across the land wall, with the heaviest concentration at the points the artillery was most actively targeting. The quality of individual soldiers varied enormously. The Genoese veterans and the Venetian sailors were capable of the disciplined, organized defense that a siege of this complexity required. Some of the Greek militia were brave men fighting for their homes. Others were civilians who had never held weapons before the Ottomans arrived. The weapons of this composite force were the weapons of the late medieval world: crossbows and longbows, Greek fire, the ancient incendiary that the Byzantines had used for centuries and whose exact formulation had been kept as a state secret, swords and spears, and the heavy stones that defenders rolled off the parapets onto attackers who reached the base of the wall. They had cannon of their own, smaller and fewer than the Ottoman artillery, but the wall proved an unsuitable platform for them. The vibration from firing cracked the masonry. The recoil pushed gun carriages into the parapet. Twice, Byzantine cannon exploded, killing their own crews and doing more structural damage to the wall than the Ottoman shot that hit the same section. The defenders had the wall, and they had Giustiniani, and they had the extraordinary fact of their own survival day after day in the face of odds that should have been immediately decisive. But they did not have enough of anything, and they knew it. The preparation for the siege's final act began, on the Ottoman side, with a crisis of confidence. By the third week of May, after more than 6 weeks of bombardment and multiple infantry assaults that had been beaten back each time, Mehmed's inner council was fracturing. The Grand Vizier, Halil Pasha, a man who had always been skeptical of the Constantinople enterprise and who had extensive connections with Byzantine diplomats, argued in council on May 26th that the siege should be abandoned. The city was holding. A Venetian relief fleet might still come. The Janissaries were taking casualties they could not easily replace. The argument was not unreasonable, strategically. Zaganos Pasha, younger and more aggressive, argued back that there would never be a better moment than this. The city was at its weakest, the defenders were exhausted, and the psychological cost of withdrawing after 7 weeks of siege would be catastrophic for Ottoman prestige. The younger commanders rose to support Zaganos. Mehmed listened to both sides and made his decision. The assault would happen on the 29th. All forces would attack simultaneously along the entire front. The Janissaries would be held in reserve until the moment was right. On the Byzantine side, the news that confirmed the council's worst fears had arrived days earlier. A Venetian ship that had slipped through the blockade on a reconnaissance mission returned without having sighted any relief fleet. The ship's captain returned because duty required it, knowing what the news would cost. Constantine received the report in his council and was silent for a long time. Then, according to the chronicler George Francis, who was present, he wept. He did not weep long. He stood, thanked the captain, and began issuing orders for the final preparations of the defence. There was nothing else to do. To surrender was to condemn the city's population to slavery and its institutions to erasure. To fight without hope of relief was to condemn them to death. He had chosen, a long time ago, which of those options he could live with. The night of May 28th was the night before the final assault, though not everyone in the city knew the timing with certainty. Mehmed had announced to his army that the attack would come soon, and the mood in the Ottoman camp, torches lit across the entire siege line, drums beginning to beat in the late evening, the audible sound of tens of thousands of men making their preparations, communicated something to the defenders that went beyond words. Constantine rode along his section of the wall that evening, stopping at each post, speaking to the men who were going to stand there in the morning. He was not wearing imperial robes, he was wearing armour. The distinction was noted. The most extraordinary event of that evening happened inside the Hagia Sophia. Constantine, in one of his last acts as emperor, led a procession to the great church, the building that had stood since Justinian built it in 537 AD, the architectural embodiment of a civilization that had endured through catastrophe after catastrophe by absorbing and outlasting what came against it. Into the Hagia Sophia that night came Orthodox and Catholic together. The theological division that had separated the Eastern and Western churches since 1054, that had been the subject of bitter councils and failed reunification attempts for a century, that had prevented Western aid from coming because Western leaders cited it as a reason why Constantine's empire was not truly their responsibility. That division dissolved, at least for the hours between Compline and Matins, in the face of something more urgent. They prayed. They took communion. They wept, some of them. The great dome above them had seen 4 centuries of liturgy and would see, within hours, the last Christian service it would hold for 567 years. In the small hours before dawn, the soldiers on the walls made their own preparations. The Genoese veterans, men who had done this before in other places, went through the rituals that experienced soldiers develop to manage the interval between knowing battle is coming and having it arrive. Checking equipment that had already been checked, sharpening blades that were already sharp, eating food that tasted of nothing because the body under extreme stress stops registering flavor. The Greek militiamen prayed in the way men pray when they are not sure their prayers will be answered, but cannot imagine not praying. Some of them scratched names into the stone of the parapets. Not graffiti, but something more deliberate, a record of presence, a statement that they had been here and that they had stood. The names are still there. Centuries of weather have faded them, but not erased them. And if you know where to look along the surviving sections of the Theodosian wall, you can still read them. Names in Greek, names in Italian, names in the half-dozen other languages of the men who held the wall until they could not hold it any more. The drums grew louder as the night went on. Then, at 1:30 in the morning, they changed. It began with sound. A wall of sound so total that several survivors compared it, independently and without apparent coordination, to the noise of the earth itself breaking apart. The Ottoman drums and cymbals and war pipes erupted along the entire 4-mile front simultaneously, and the noise they produced was not simply loud, but disorienting, in the way that physical shock is disorienting. The kind of sound that the body registers before the brain does, and that arrives as sensation, pressure, vibration, a feeling in the sternum that something enormous has been set in motion. Then the torches moved. The entire siege line shifted, and the shifting of it resolved as defenders' eyes adjusted into the shapes of men. Thousands of men, then tens of thousands, moving toward the wall in the darkness. The first wave was the Bashi bazooks. They came across the moat and the killing ground, with the particular ferocity of men who had been given a terrible assignment and had accepted it. The Bashi bazooks were the Ottoman irregular infantry, recruited from across the empire and beyond it, paid nothing in salary but promised a share of whatever plunder the city produced if it fell. They were not the empire's best soldiers. They were not equipped with the precision weapons of the regular army or trained in the disciplined formations of the Janissaries. What they had was numbers, aggression, and the knowledge that retreat was not a good option. Mehmed had positioned cavalry behind his own lines specifically to cut down men who tried to pull back without orders. They came screaming, and they came in mass, and the wall above them lit up with Greek fire and crossbow bolts and the heavy stones that the defenders had been stacking for weeks. The Byzantine defence, in these first terrible minutes, was exactly what Giustiniani had trained it to be. The Genoese professionals, on the most critical sections of the wall, did not panic. They drew, they released, they drew again. The Greek fire, that ancient incendiary formula that clung to whatever it touched and burned at temperatures that water could not extinguish, poured down the face of the wall in streams that turned the climbing attackers into human torches, and the screaming that this produced was different in quality from the screaming of men who are simply frightened, a higher and more terrible register that some of the defenders would spend the rest of their lives trying not to hear again. But Mehmed had not sent the Bashi bazooks expecting them to break the wall. He had sent them expecting them to die against it, wearing the defenders down, forcing them to spend energy and ammunition and emotional endurance on men whose function was not to win, but to exhaust. This was the Ottoman strategy on a human scale. Throw the expendable forces first, drain the defence, and commit the decisive forces only when the defence had been weakened enough to make their intervention conclusive. For 2 hours, the Bashi bazooks came and came and came. They were repulsed. They regrouped. They came again. The bodies in the moat and the killing ground accumulated, and the wall above them grew darker with the residue of what had been burned and thrown from it, and the defenders held. But holding cost something. Every crossbow bolt fired was a crossbow bolt that would not be available later. Every man who took a cut from a grapple hook or a thrown stone or the debris from a failed Greek fire discharge was a man who was operating at reduced capacity for the rest of the night. The Byzantines had been given no reserves to speak of. There was no second line. The men on the wall were the defence, and when they were gone, there was nothing behind them. By 3 a.m, Mehmed pulled the Bashi bazooks back. The drums changed rhythm, signalling the withdrawal, and the irregular mass that had been pressing against the wall for 2 hours pulled away from it like a tide going out, not in panic or defeat, but in the orderly withdrawal of men who had accomplished their task, which was not to win, but to be survived. In the quiet that followed, brief and strange, the defenders on the wall could hear each other breathing. The Anatolian regulars came next. They were a different order of opponent from the Bashi bazooks, trained infantry from the Ottoman Corps army, equipped with mail and plate, carrying siege ladders that had been constructed specifically to the height of the damaged sections of the Theodosian wall, advancing in formations that maintained their coherence under fire in the way that years of drill make possible. They moved toward the wall with the methodical patience of men who have been told exactly what they are going to do and have done similar things before. And the quality of their advance, the way the formations compressed around casualties without losing their shape, the way the ladder parties reached the wall base and planted their equipment while others kept the defenders occupied, demonstrated what experienced soldiers look like when they are allowed to operate near their actual capacity. The fighting at the wall became close and personal in a way the first phase had not been. The Bashi bazooks had largely been killed at range, in the killing ground and on the approaches to the wall. The Anatolian regulars were getting their ladders up, and some of them were reaching the parapet, and the fighting that followed was the brutal, wordless, physical violence of men who are occupying the same 3 square feet of stone and have exactly one objective. Giustiniani moved along the wall in these hours, not commanding from a safe distance, but physically present at the crisis points, directing men, filling gaps, his own weapons in use. Constantine was at the gate of St. Romanus, which was taking the heaviest artillery fire, and against which Mehmed had concentrated his largest bombards and his best regular infantry. The bombardment had not stopped when the infantry assault began. The cannon continued firing into the darkness above the close-quarter fighting, stone balls shrieking over the heads of both the attackers and the defenders in a hazard that killed men on both sides with equal indifference. But the wall held. An hour into the Anatolian assault, then 2 hours, then approaching 3 hours before first light, the defence was still intact. Sections of the wall had been pushed to the edge, moments where Ottoman soldiers had gained the parapet and been killed before they could consolidate. Moments where a breach in the earthwork fill that the repair crews had installed threatened to open into a passable gap, but nothing had broken through. Giustiniani was everywhere that the line was thin. Constantine was at the worst point, and had been there since the assault began. The defenders were running on something beyond exhaustion by now, a physical state produced by extreme stress and sustained effort, and the particular neurological clarity that comes when the body understands that it is fighting for its life. A state that is not sustainable, but that can last for hours in men who are determined enough not to yield. Then, as the sky was beginning to show the first barely perceptible lightning in the east that precedes dawn, Giustiniani was hit. The accounts do not agree on exactly what hit him. A crossbow bolt, according to some, a ball from a small cannon, according to others, a javelin, according to a third version that may have been confused with an earlier incident. What is not disputed is the result. A wound serious enough that he could not continue fighting, in a location, the joint between his armor and his side, that was not immediately fatal but was clearly incapacitating. He told Constantine he needed to leave the wall. Constantine, by the accounts, begged him to stay. The city was still holding. The assault had not broken through. If Giustiniani could just hold his position for another hour, for another half hour, for another few minutes. The plea of a man who understood precisely what would happen when the section of the wall that depended on this particular soldier's presence was deprived of it. Giustiniani could not stay. He was carried from the wall. The defenders saw him go. This is the moment that the siege turned. And it turned not because of what happened physically, but because of what happened in the minds of the men on the wall. In the psychology of defensive combat, there is a phenomenon that military historians call the morale cascade. The sudden, non-linear collapse of a force's will to continue fighting that is not proportional to the physical losses it has sustained, but is instead triggered by a signal event. Something that the soldiers on the line interpret as evidence that the situation is beyond recovery. The signal event does not have to be an actual collapse. It can be the departure of a trusted commander, the sight of a flag going down, a rumor spreading faster than any fact can be verified. When Giustiniani left the wall, the Genoese veterans who had been holding the most critical sections, men who were not cowards, men who had fought for 7 weeks in conditions that would have broken lesser soldiers, saw their best man being carried away and drew a conclusion. Not a conclusion that can be faulted exactly, given everything they knew, but a fatal one. Mehmed had been watching the wall from his command position, surrounded by his senior commanders, receiving reports from his field officers throughout the night. He saw the Bashi Bazouk assault absorb its casualties and accomplish its wearing-down purpose. He saw the Anatolian regulars reach the parapet and be beaten back and reach it again. He saw the defence hold when it should, by any reasonable accounting of the available forces, have already broken. And then, in the first grey light before dawn, he saw something change in the quality of the resistance. A slackening, a pulling back, a rearrangement in the silhouettes on the parapet that suggested disorder rather than the disciplined compression of a line sealing its gaps. The moment had come. He turned to his Janissary commanders and gave the order. The Janissaries had been waiting since before midnight, formed up and ready, and they had spent the preceding hours watching the Bashi Bazouks and the Anatolians go in and come back and go in again without breaking through, which had produced in them not discouragement, but a tightly controlled impatience. The impatience of men who have been held in reserve while others are used up, who know their turn is coming and who have been trained from the time they were taken from their families as children and remade into something that the Byzantine Empire that they were now attacking had helped create. to convert that impatience into explosive directional force at the exact moment the signal is given. They move toward the wall in the half-dark with the sound of 10,000 men in formation. Not the screaming chaos of the Bashi bazooks, not the steady mechanical advance of the Anatolian regulars, but something different, something with a rhythm to it, a cadence of boots and equipment that the defenders still standing recognized instinctively as the sound of men who have not yet been used up and know it. At the same moment, the Janissaries reached the main wall. A smaller event occurred at a point called the Kirkoporta, a postern gate in the Blachernai section, a small door in the wall that had been used for sorties during the early weeks of the siege and that someone, in the chaos and exhaustion of the night, had neglected to lock. Or perhaps it had been forced. Or perhaps it had never been properly secured after the last time it was used. The accounts are not clear, and the accounts never became clear, because the people who might have been able to explain it were dead before the morning was out. What is clear is that a group of Ottoman soldiers found it open, went through it, and found themselves inside the outer enclosure of the Blachernai wall. Not yet inside the city, but inside the defensive system, in a position from which the inner wall could be attacked from the rear. They did not have to attack. They climbed. A small Ottoman force scaled the inside of a Blachernai tower in the confusion of the main assault and reached the top. And at the top, they did the single most important thing they could have done, the thing that ended the siege not by force, but by symbol. They hauled down the Byzantine flag. The flag came down. The crescent went up in its place, visible in the growing light of dawn across the section of wall where the defence was already wavering. The city has fallen. 3 words, in Greek, in Italian, in whatever language they were spoken in the moment they were first understood. The exact words do not survive. What survives is the effect. The defenders on the wall heard it. Some of them saw the flag. The ones who neither heard nor saw knew something had changed by the change in the fighting. The difference in the quality of the Ottoman assault when the attackers understand they are winning. The difference in the quality of the defence when the defenders understand they are not. The line broke. Not everywhere at once. Not in a single moment of universal collapse. But section by section, post by post, the Byzantine defence on the Theodosian wall ceased to function as a coordinated system and became instead a collection of individual last stands. Men who fought on because there was nowhere to go, because the instinct not to yield was deeper than the calculation that yielding might produce a marginally better outcome, because they had already decided how this was going to end and they intended it to end on their feet. The Janissaries poured through the breaches that the bombardment had created in the earthwork fill. Ottoman soldiers came through the Kirkoporta and spread into the Blachernai district. The main Ottoman command ordered a general advance along the full length of the front, and the Ottoman army that had been waiting outside the Theodosian wall for 53 days moved forward through the openings and over the bodies and into the city. Constantine XI Palaiologos was last seen near the gate of St. Romanus, in the worst of the fighting, in the company of a few remaining defenders who had not broken. He had taken off, at some point in the final hour, whatever imperial insignia he had been wearing, so that he would not be immediately identifiable. A practical precaution that also reads, in retrospect, as something more deliberate, a decision about how an emperor who had always been primarily a soldier should end. The accounts of what followed are multiple and irreconcilable. He was killed in the fighting at the gate. He was cut down by Janissaries who found him after the breach. He charged into the Ottoman mass and disappeared into it. He survived and was captured and executed. He survived and escaped. The body was never found, and the body's absence became, in the years that followed, a space that imagination filled with what it needed. The most reliable account, pieced together from the testimonies of survivors on both sides, suggests that he died in the fighting near the gate of St. Romanus in the early morning of May 29th, that his body was found afterward among the dead, identified by the imperial eagles embroidered on his boots, the one piece of imperial dress he had not removed, and that his head was cut off and brought to Mehmed, who ordered it mounted on a column in what had just become his new capital. Later accounts dispute this. Mehmed's own chronicles are evasive on the subject. The most likely truth is probably the simplest. Constantine XI died fighting on the wall he had defended for 53 days, surrounded by men who died with him, and his body was lost in the chaos that followed the breach, and no one thought to look for it carefully until it was too late to find anything certain. What the Greeks preferred to believe was something else entirely. An angel, the story went, had taken the emperor at the last moment and hidden him under the Golden Gate at the western end of the city, turned to marble, sleeping, waiting for the day when the city would need him again. The marble emperor, the king who would come back. The story spread through the Greek communities of the Ottoman Empire and the diaspora with the speed of something that answers a need, and it persisted for centuries in exactly the same way that such stories persist, not because anyone believed it literally, necessarily, but because it gave the loss a shape that was bearable, a shape that contained within it the possibility of something other than permanent defeat. Mehmed II entered the city in the afternoon, riding a white horse through the gate of Carisius. He rode through streets that were still smoking, past residents who were being marched in columns toward the collection points where they would be evaluated and assigned to slavery or ransom, depending on their status and the luck of their capture. He rode to the Hagia Sophia. He dismounted at the door and, by the account of several witnesses, bent down and took a handful of earth and sprinkled it over his turban, a gesture of humility before God, an acknowledgement that whatever he had achieved here was God's achievement rather than his own. He walked into the great church and looked up at the dome, which had been the largest in the world for 9 centuries, and the light coming through the windows, the particular quality of light in the Hagia Sophia that had moved a delegation from Prince Vladimir of Kiev to report, in 987, that they had not known whether they were in heaven or on earth, fell on him, as it had fallen on the emperors and patriarchs and priests and congregations of 12 centuries. He converted it to a mosque that afternoon. The Christian mosaics would be plastered over. The bells would be silenced. The liturgy of the Orthodox Church that had echoed under that dome since 537 would not sound there again for 5 centuries. The battle had ended. The counting began. Constantine XI's body was never found, or if it was found, it was never identified with the certainty that the historical record required. The head, mounted on a column in the Forum, was accepted as his by the Ottoman authorities. The Greek community accepted it only reluctantly and with reservations that persisted for generations. His closest advisor, George Sphrantzes, who had been present for the fall and had been captured and enslaved, spent years after his eventual liberation writing down everything he could remember about the man and the siege, a document that serves as one of the most important primary sources for the events of 1453, and that reads, in its emotional register, less like historical chronicle and more like an act of grief. Giovanni Giustiniani reached the island of Chios on the ship that had evacuated him from the wall and died there of his wounds within days. He never learned that the wall he had defended for 7 weeks had lasted exactly as long as he had been able to stand on it. Loukas Notaras, the Byzantine admiral and Constantine's senior surviving official, was captured by Mehmed and initially offered favourable terms, and then, within days, executed, along with his sons, in circumstances that the Ottoman sources do not fully explain, and that the Greek sources attribute to Mehmed's suspicion that Notaras was attempting to organise resistance within the captured city. Cardinal Isidore of Kiev, who had come to Constantinople to represent the papal position on church union and had instead found himself fighting on the walls, escaped by exchanging clothes with a slave and was sold into the slave market without being recognised, subsequently ransomed, and returned to Rome to spend the rest of his life writing accounts of what he had witnessed. Mehmed allowed 3 days of plunder, as was the custom, the period during which soldiers were permitted to take whatever they could carry from the conquered city as compensation for the campaign, a medieval practice that served as both motivation and payment. The 3 days of plunder in Constantinople were not, by the standards of medieval urban conquest, uniquely catastrophic. There were massacres in the first hours. There was extensive looting of churches and private homes. The population of roughly 30,000, already reduced from the city's former levels by the long economic decline and by the emigrations that had begun as the siege became obviously imminent, was largely enslaved, with the wealthy and educated being held for ransom and the rest assigned to whatever their captors determined. Libraries were ransacked. Manuscripts were burned or sold or taken as prizes or lost in the chaos. But Mehmed stopped the plunder after 3 days. This, too, was custom, but it required enforcement, and Mehmed enforced it. He was not interested in a ruined city. He was interested in a capital, and a capital needed to be capable of functioning as one. He moved quickly to repopulate Constantinople with a mix of Ottoman administrators, Greek residents who were brought back under guarantees of protection, Jewish communities relocated from other parts of the empire, and colonists from across Anatolia. The restoration of the city's commercial and administrative functions was a priority from the first days of Ottoman rule. Constantinople, renamed Istanbul in the Ottoman usage, though the older name persisted in European diplomatic correspondence for years, was declared the new Ottoman capital, replacing Adrianople. Mehmed would spend the rest of his life adding to it: the Grand Bazaar, the Topkapi Palace, the Fatih Mosque built on the site of the demolished Church of the Holy Apostles, where several Byzantine emperors, and perhaps Constantine XI's bones, had been interred. The Ottoman losses during the siege are difficult to establish with precision, and the sources that attempt to quantify them range across an implausibly wide interval, from the conservative estimate of 15,000 dead to claims of 50,000 or more. The lower figure is more credible, but still represents an enormous cost for a force of the size Mehmed deployed. The Byzantine and Allied dead numbered roughly 5,000, including a disproportionate share of the professional soldiers who had formed the defence's core, the Genoese veterans, the Venetian sailors, the Catalans. Among the civilians, several thousand died in the fighting and the 3 days of plunder that followed. The chain across the Golden Horn was captured intact and became, in later years, a trophy displayed in Constantinople as evidence of the siege's audacity. Fragments of it survive to this day in the Turkish and Islamic Arts Museum in Istanbul. Thick iron links that were manufactured to hold against any naval force, and that held, in the end, against everything, except a plan that bypassed them entirely. The walls themselves, the Theodosian wall that had stood for 1,000 years and had survived every previous assault without being breached from the outside, bore the evidence of what had been done to them, in a way that was impossible to repair or deny. The sections targeted by the basilica and the largest bombards were not simply damaged, they had been fundamentally altered in their structural integrity, reduced in places from the clean stone masonry of the original construction to irregular rubble fills and earthwork patches that had served well enough for the defence, but that left the wall's profile permanently compromised. Mehmed ordered repairs eventually. The repairs were made. But the Theodosian wall, after May 29, 1453, was never the military argument it had been. The argument had been answered. And the answer was not another army or a longer siege or a more clever stratagem. The answer was physics. The answer was gunpowder and bronze, and a Hungarian engineer who had asked one emperor for a commission and been turned away. On April 12, 1453, 6 weeks before the final assault, Mehmed's gunners had fired the first coordinated artillery barrage in the history of warfare. 14 batteries firing simultaneously along a 4-mile front. Dozens of cannon and bombards releasing at the same moment, the sound of it registering as far as Adrianople. Nothing like it had ever happened before. The Theodosian wall had survived earthquakes, had survived the Black Death's decimation of the population that maintained it, had survived Byzantine civil wars and Latin occupation and the slow erosion of centuries. It had not been built to survive this. Nothing had been built to survive this, because nothing like this had existed before to be survived. The Ottoman Empire that inherited Constantinople in 1453 was already the dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean. But the conquest transformed its character and its ambitions in ways that would shape European history for the next 2 centuries. Constantinople was not simply a new capital. It was a legitimizing symbol, a demonstration that the Ottoman state was not a successor to the petty kingdoms and frontier polities that the Byzantine Empire had, in its long decline, surrounded itself with, but something that claimed continuity with Rome itself. Mehmed took the title Caesar of Rome, Caesar-i Rum, within weeks of the conquest, a claim that most European monarchs rejected, but that the Ottoman Empire maintained, and that shaped its foreign policy and its self-understanding for generations. The removal of Constantinople as the eastern anchor of Christian Europe meant that there was no longer any significant military barrier between the Ottoman Balkans and Vienna. Serbia fell in 1459, Bosnia in 1463. By the end of Mehmed's reign in 1481, Ottoman territory extended to the Adriatic coast and the Danube, and the question of whether the empire would stop at the gates of Vienna or proceed through them had become one of the central strategic anxieties of European statecraft. But the consequences of May 29, 1453, were not only military. They were technological, economic, and intellectual. And taken together, they constitute a disruption of the existing world order, comprehensive enough to warrant the label that historians have traditionally assigned to it: the end of the Middle Ages. The technological disruption was the most immediately obvious. The fall of Constantinople was the proof-of-concept demonstration that changed the practice of European siege warfare permanently and irreversibly. Before 1453, the conventional wisdom about fortification, a wisdom backed by centuries of practical experience, was that high stone walls were the decisive variable in a siege, that the side with better walls would outlast any attacker who could not achieve total isolation, and that the way to build strong defensive positions was to build them tall and thick. After 1453, every military architect in Europe had to reckon with the fact that the strongest walls in the world had been broken by cannon in 7 weeks. The new defensive architecture that emerged over the following decades, the bastion system, with its low, thick, angled earthwork walls designed to absorb rather than resist artillery impact, its star-shaped profile designed to eliminate dead ground, its complete rejection of the vertical stone wall aesthetic that had defined military construction since the Romans, was a direct response to what Mehmed's guns had done to the Theodosian wall. The medieval castle was not obsolete immediately, but it was obsolete. The memo had been sent. It would take a generation for the full implications to be absorbed, but the direction was clear. The economic disruption was less dramatic in its immediate manifestation, but more consequential in its long-term effects. Constantinople had been, for as long as the trade routes between Europe and Asia had existed in their medieval form, one of the critical choke points through which that trade flowed. A node where goods from the Silk Road were transferred to Mediterranean shipping and distributed westward. A city whose position at the junction of Europe and Asia made it commercially indispensable, and had been one of the sources of Byzantine wealth and Byzantine importance, even as Byzantine power declined. Ottoman control of Constantinople was not, strictly speaking, a blockade of European-Asian trade. The Ottomans were not uninterested in tariff revenue, and were in fact quite willing to allow trade to continue under their supervision and their taxation. But the combination of Ottoman control, the increased tariffs, and the instability of a newly conquered city reorganizing its commercial infrastructure, and the persistent European anxiety about dependence on a Muslim power for access to the goods that European markets demanded, created a powerful motivation to find alternative routes. The Portuguese had been working their way down the African coast for decades already. The fall of Constantinople did not create the age of exploration, but it did accelerate the logic behind it. Columbus sailed in 1492. Vasco da Gama reached India by the Cape route in 1498. The Ottoman Empire, by sealing one door, had inadvertently pushed the European commercial imagination toward an entirely different set of doors. Doors that opened onto the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean, and ultimately onto a reconfiguration of global trade that reduced the Mediterranean world from the center of everything to one region among several. The intellectual disruption was perhaps the most personally important of the three, though it was also the least predictable and the most diffuse. Constantinople had been, through the long centuries of Byzantine survival, one of the major repositories of classical knowledge. A city where manuscripts of ancient Greek philosophy, science, and literature had been copied and preserved and studied when they were unavailable or unknown in Western Europe. The scholars and educated men and women who fled Constantinople in the years before and after 1453, carrying manuscripts, carrying the knowledge of the Greek language at a level of precision that Western European scholars had not possessed for centuries. Carrying familiarity with Aristotle and Plato and Archimedes in their original texts rather than in the imperfect Latin translations that had been the only version available in the West. Landed primarily in Italy, where the conditions for the reception of classical knowledge were already favourable. Florence, Venice, Rome. They brought what they had saved into an intellectual environment that was ready to use it. The Renaissance had roots and causes that predate 1453, but the acceleration that Byzantine emigration produced in the humanist project, the recovery of ancient knowledge, the application of it to art and philosophy and science, the reorientation of European intellectual life around human capacity and classical achievement rather than theological authority, was real and documented and historically significant in ways that the scholars who produced it understood at the time. The Encyclopaedia Britannica's assessment, written long after the fact with the benefit of perspective, is blunt. The exodus of Greeks to Italy as a result of the fall of Constantinople marked the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the Renaissance. None of this was visible on May 29, 1453, to the people walking through the smoking ruins of the city, or the people watching from a distance with horror, and the particular helplessness of those who had failed to act in time. What was visible was the end of an empire, the end of a tradition, the end of the 1100-year-long Roman experiment that had begun with Augustus and survived, in one form or another, in this city on the Bosphorus, through everything that history had thrown at it. The Hagia Sophia still stands. The Ottoman plastering that covered its Christian mosaics was removed in the 20th century, when Kemal Ataturk made the building a museum, and for 86 years the mosaics and the Arabic calligraphy existed together under the same dome, a layered record of what the place had been and what it had become. In 2020, the Turkish government converted it back to a mosque. The mosaics remain covered during prayer times with curtains. The dome still produces its particular quality of light. The building that was consecrated in 537 AD, that fell to the Fourth Crusade in 1204 and was recovered, that heard the last Christian liturgy of the Byzantine Empire on the evening of May 28, 1453, continues to absorb what history brings to it. The Theodosian Wall still stands, or most of it does. Sections have been demolished over the centuries, by earthquakes, by urban development, by the ordinary attrition of structures that no one is actively maintaining. But large stretches survive along the western edge of Istanbul, their towers still rising above the neighbourhoods that have grown up around them, their stone bearing the marks of the 1453 bombardment in ways that careful examination reveals: the irregular patching, the different texture of the repair work, the places where the original Roman masonry was blown apart and replaced with whatever could be found quickly. You can walk along the base of the wall on a morning when the light is right and understand, in a way that no photograph or description quite conveys, the scale of what was defended here and what it cost to defend it. And somewhere in that wall, in the stone that absorbed the prayers and the names scratched by soldiers who knew they were not going home, somewhere in that 1,000-year argument against the forces trying to end it, something persists that is harder to name than history and more durable than empires. The names are still there. The men who scratched them are gone. The world they were defending is gone. But the scratching remains, which is, in the end, the only immortality that most of us can reasonably expect. To have been present, to have stood at the critical moment, to have held the line as long as it could be held. An emperor with no army took off his imperial robes and became a soldier. A wall that had stood for 1,000 years broke in a single morning. A world ended, and what came after it? The gunpowder empires, the age of exploration, the Renaissance, the modern world in all its complexity and violence and possibility, began in the smoke and rubble of what the cannon had unmade. Centuries later, on a quiet morning in Istanbul, a tourist walks along the base of the Theodosian Wall and stops to read a scratched name in the stone, worn thin by weather, but still legible if you look carefully enough. Still there after 570 years, still insisting on the fact of a presence that the collapse of everything around it could not entirely erase. The world the name-scratcher defended is gone. The name remains. That is the last thing medieval warfare left behind. Not the empires it built or the cities it destroyed, but the names of the people who stood in the way and held as long as holding was possible. And then did not hold any more. and still managed, somehow, to matter.